Welcome. Thank you so much for the invitation to present our current project, Hidden Hands in Colonial Natural Histories. I'm Victoria Dickenson, Professor of Practice at McGill Libraries, and joining me is Project Senior Research Associate, Dr. Anna Winterbottom. We'd like to acknowledge that even though we are meeting in the indefinable space of the internet, we're tied to our particular places. McGill University is situated on a site which has long served as a place of meeting and exchange among Indigenous people, including Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous people whose presence marks this territory. Our project, Hidden Hands in Colonial Natural Histories, is based at McGill University Libraries in Montreal and is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The project began in 2022, and we are now in the final year. Before we start, please be aware that this talk does contain some distressing references to racial violence. Anna?
Thanks, Victoria. I'll start by talking about the concept of hidden hands, where it came from, and why we think the term is useful. The idea of hidden hands emerged from a previous project, the Quillen Project, and specifically from this watercolor, painted by Mary Simons in Madras, now Chennai, in the early 19th century. Here we see two expert bird catchers swaddling birds in cloth. Simons' sister Elizabeth Quillen relied on these experts to produce ornithological watercolors, which are some of the most detailed and lifelike images made in the period. The knowledge and skill of the bird catchers was essential to these images, but without Simons' portrait, we never would have recognized this. This image prompted us to think about all the other hidden hands behind natural history collections. Hidden hands in the context of natural history implies hands-on, practical, manual work, and the expert knowledge guiding that work. We like the openness of the concept of hidden hands. In colonial settings, we found that unacknowledged people behind the collections included the wives and children of naturalists, who often had stronger local ties, including through mixed race or Creole identities. Hidden hands could also include servants and enslaved people, local guides, and Indigenous knowledge keepers. Among these different types of hidden hands, some had more agency and received more credit for their work than others, and we will highlight these disparities in our examples.
Our project is based on 4 case studies focused on different parts of the world and different types of material collection. Herbarium specimens, palm leaf manuscripts, as you see in the right-hand corner of the slide, material belongings like beadwork, and archival natural history illustrations. All these materials date from between the 18th and 19th century and are kept at McGill in 3 repositories: the Blackerwood Natural History Collection and Rare Books and Special Collections at the library, the McGill Herbarium, and the Redpath Museum. We also worked with partner institutions who hold similar collections and who can disseminate research findings to diverse audiences. Besides the official partners, we have developed an international network of biologists and art historians, literary scholars, and experts in languages, as well as historians, knowledge keepers, and practitioners. We relied on the network for many of the insights and findings we're presenting today. Our student RAs have also made invaluable contributions to the project. We used a number of diverse approaches to speak to these materials: communal biography, the juxtaposition of different source materials, identification, both scientific identification and naming in multiple languages, documentation and cataloging, conservation and digitization, study visits, and recreation. And we'll talk about all of these in terms of our case studies. Next slide. Our source for the French Caribbean was a 4-volume album of watercolor paintings by a French engineer, René Gabriel de Rabier, made between 1767 and 1784 in Saint-Domingue, now Haiti. Cataloging the paintings and identifying the plants and animals restores historic names and knowledge. De Rabier used many Creole and local names for plants and animals. For example, he calls this red-tailed hawk the malfini. Malfini may be how French colonists heard the word manfini, which was an indigenous Taino or Carib name. Durabier's wife came from a large Creole family in Saint-Domingue. Did she name the birds for him? Today in Haitian Creole, the bird is Melphini Rouge, and this name acknowledges an identifying characteristic of the bird's appearance. Rouge means red tail. Communal biography employs close readings of archival documents and imaginative leaps into new narratives to extend our focus to the lives of others. After the artist's death, Durabier's daughter and grandson annotated the watercolors, adding additional information on how plants were grown and eaten and by whom, or on the effects of some insect bites. Durabier's albums were a family enterprise. Going beyond those who leave at least some traces in colonial archives can be difficult. Saint-Domingue was a slave society. Who were the enslaved servants who made Durabier's family life possible? Notices in Affiche Américaine, the newspaper of Cap Français, now Cap Haïtien, record the escape of 3 enslaved people from Durabier's household. The brief notices are shocking. Jean-Louis, Marie-Jeanne, and Louison were all branded Rabier on their left breasts. Were these the people who tended the gardens, caught the fish, fed the caterpillars, cleaned the brushes? This painting by a French artist shows a market in Martinique where enslaved people sold birds, fish, and turtles, like those which were painted by Durabier. What else can we learn from the records of colonial administrators or artists that can help us see more of the lives of others? For the Métis homeland in Canada, we examined a plant collection made in the early 1830s by an Englishwoman, Frances Simpson, in what is now Manitoba. Simpson noted in just one case an Indigenous name associated with the plant she collected. Next to her specimen of fireweed, which you can see on the right, she wrote Uthkapuk, likely referring to its Cree name. Fireweed has many medicinal uses in First Nations cultures, although Simpson was apparently unaware of this, referring to it only as handsome. Simpson may have learnt this name from local women, including servants, midwives, and wet nurses. However, there is no evidence of this in her surviving correspondence. Simpson herself was deliberately isolated from local people in the community by her husband, George Simpson. Juxtaposing Simpson's plant collections with beadwork made by Métis women during a similar time period is one way to think about the types of knowledge that were excluded from the herbarium. This beaded bag held in the McCord Stewart Museum shows the iconic prairie rose and hummingbirds. Dr. Frida Beauregard, curator of the McGill Herbarium, was able to identify botanically almost all the plants that Frances Simpson collected. Doing so revealed some insights about the changing environment. For example, the 2 plants shown here have now disappeared from the Manitoba region. Anna?
For our India case study, we focused on the writings and drawings of James Forbes, an East India Company employee in Western India during the 18th century. Forbes's archives are held mainly in Yale's Centre for British Art, but also at McGill in the British Library and in private collections. Our aim was to use Forbes's vast archives to reveal the processes of assemblage and appropriation involved in the making of colonial natural histories. For example, Forbes's archives reveal that he bought caged birds and animals and used them as a basis for many of his drawings. This unusual image shows the southern red bishop inside a cage made from an ostrich egg, both purchased in South Africa. Forbes also relied on the work of Indian and Chinese artists. He visited menageries and drew taxidermized birds from Southeast Asia. Here are 3 examples of people whose work was essential to Forbes's collection and writings. First, Forbes's gardener, who he calls Harabai, planted and maintained the gardens, including a menagerie. His work enabled Forbes to depict plants and animals. Second, Raji Singh, who Forbes describes as a bard. Singh took a lead in negotiations with local and regional rulers, and very likely shaped Forbes's accounts of Indian history. Forbes also relied on a range of Indian friends and patrons, and one of these men was Sadinand Vyas, whom Dr. Samira Sheikh identified as the author of a series of drawings, now among Forbes's papers at Yale. Like Durabier, Forbes also drew on the labour and expertise of enslaved people when making his collections. One such person was a young boy when he was part of Forbes's household in Gujarat, and he later travelled with Forbes back to England. What happened to this unnamed young man we can only imagine by drawing on the lives of other enslaved people who found themselves in Britain during the late 18th century. For example, here is an advertisement for an East India lad, aged 17, who had escaped enslavement in Britain. In our Sri Lanka case study, we looked at a series of artifacts and palm leaf manuscripts, or ollas, relating to healing, which are now in the Redpath Museum and the Blacker Wood collection at McGill. In this case study, we asked how we might reinterpret material belongings, images, and texts held within natural history collections. What new stories might they hold about the natural world? For example, this manuscript was catalogued as zoological, whereas in fact it's a manuscript on astrology. Conservation and digitisation of the materials was particularly important for the Sri Lankan manuscripts, since these are of both historical and current interest in Sri Lanka. In this image, Dr. Danister Pereira, who visited McGill thanks to a Mary Nicholson Fellowship at the Oslo Library, is demonstrating Sri Lankan conservation techniques during a visit to the Canadian Conservation Institute in Ottawa. Dr. Pereira also contributed to the cataloguing of the ollas, and the McGill University Library is now digitising all the manuscripts in the collection. Over to you, Victoria.
Thank you, Anna. One of the goals of the project is to ensure that what we learn is available not only in scholarly publications, but is embedded in the archival and catalog descriptions of materials. Our cataloging spreadsheets are based on the metadata required by ATOM, or Access to Materials, an open source application for standards-based archival description used at McGill. We share the spreadsheets on Google Drive so that collaborators can access them and fill in information like scientific name, watermarks, and local names. A key component of the project was study visits, which enabled interdisciplinary conversations centered on collections. Here, Dr. Pereira is shown discussing the care and storage of the Sri Lankan collections with Annie Lucier, the curator of world cultures at the Redpath Museum. We also hosted Dr. S. Subramanya, or Subu, who is shown here discussing the bird collections with Redpath Museum curator Anthony Wayne Howell. Dr. Subramanya was also able to identify all the birds depicted by James Forbes. We also worked with contemporary artists and scholar practitioners during the project. Haitian visual artist Clovis Alexandre Desvarieux is shown here examining the Durabier volumes with members of the project team at the library. And last year, Dr. Frida Beauregard traveled with the herbarium collection made by Francis Simpson and took them home to the Métis homeland in Manitoba. She examined them with the contemporary Métis botanists and beadwork artists. The group also examined bead and belongings in the Manitoba Museum, some of which are pictured here. Is that artifacts in museums, including plant collections and herbaria, have emotional value. They can provide connection to past environments as well as to human ancestors. Many of the experts we work with said that the material belongings should be considered living beings and sometimes as non-human ancestors, and that they benefit from use and from touch. Anna.
Hands-on work provides another way to connect with the materials and with some of the hidden hands behind their creation. Dr. Rajashi Sengupta visited from IIT Kanpur to work on the Forbes archive. He also led a hands-on dyeing workshop using plant materials from India, and this provided a powerful demonstration of how Forbes himself drew on the work of Indian textile artists. Juliet Mackey, a contemporary beadwork artist, spent time in the McCord Stewart Museum, working alongside the beaded belongings, and she described this as beading with the ancestors. The historical materials inspired her to make the flat beaded piece shown here, in a departure from her usual style. And finally, Dr. Pereira demonstrated for library staff the process of writing on palm leaves using a stylus, showing how the rounded script used in Sri Lanka evolved to suit the manuscript materials. Here he's using a historical stylus from the Redpath Museum, which was collected alongside the manuscripts.
As our project draws to a close, we're translating what we learned from close collaborative study into publications, catalogs, and exhibitions. We continue our webinar series on the Consortium for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine platform, and are planning a new project with multiple partners, the Natural History Humanities Lab. We'll now end with thanks to our funders, our partners and research collaborators, and to our research assistants who have been invaluable members of the network. To learn more, please visit our website, hiddenhands.ca. Thank you so much.